I've said it before, I'll say it again. Anunnaki. Let's enter the buzzsaw.
Central Intelligence Agency.
It was described by witnesses as
Gerald Clark graduated with a BS in computer engineering and an MSEE in electronic circuits and systems, and he is now the author of books dealing with the Anunnaki. His first book was called The Anunnaki of Nibiru, and most recently, The Seventh Planet, Mercury Rising. So we'll be discussing with him who the Anunnaki are, what they came here to do, why they left, where we're going, what's going on. Let's find out. Gerald, thanks for joining us.
Hey, it's a real pleasure to be here, Sean. I want to wish you and all your audience a warm welcome.
Well, thank you. Let's start with, before diving into this vast subject of ancient aliens, let's start with how you personally got into this field of studying the Anunnaki, or the gods who came from the sky or the heavens to Earth.
Well, I'll give you kind of the shorter story. I've told the long version before, but a lot of it started with having no interest in history as an engineer, doing international travel, especially to Turkey and that area, and then realizing that it was to my benefit to at least know something about other people's cultures before I went and hung around with them and did business with them. So I started looking into some of the stories that were told about the ancient races and peoples of Turkey. And it just so happened I was reading Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and he was talking about an old city in Turkey that really caught my attention, and they were an obsidian trading center that never got destroyed because it also turned into a kind of a spiritual center, and that was the city of Catalhayek. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But one thing led to another after my exposure to Turkey, and I suddenly got an interest in history, and we had a little bit of a hiatus and downtime in the telecom market, where I was working as a VP of engineering at LightPoint Communications. And I decided to catch up on everything I was reading, and I was going to write a book on ancient technology, and one thing led to another, and I stumbled across von Daniken's book and Sitchin's books and started realizing people had written in this space, and that kind of turned me on to the topic, and it was answering questions that I had my whole life, specifically about human origins. So that got me started, and once I read all the material, I started correlating, and this was back in approximately the year 2000. So I started correlating just big items like, okay, supposedly they were in Africa, and I looked into that. So that's really with the genesis of it, and then I went much deeper after that. So in 2004, after reading all of Sitchin's work, and many other authors as well, I looked at George Smith's work I looked at the myths from Mesopotamia from the University of Oxford, and several others, and looked at all the stuff that was online. You know, they were starting to show up with electronic databases that you could search. And I guess at that point I was not really an astute historian, because I didn't really know how to take all these names and all these events and correlate them in some sort of picture that made sense to an engineer. So being an engineer, I started jotting down names and doing relational charts, and one thing led to another, and I ended up with about a 7-foot tall table of, I guess a genealogy table, if you will, that I was using as a working model so that I could make sure that I had the best story of who was who. Well, in that process of reading this material, looking at these names, seeing that they were in various cultures, I started going, well, if they were in this culture under this being and they're under this culture under that name, how could they be the same being? And this was the key for me to unlock the mystery and the secret of the Anunnaki. Mm-hmm. And in particular, I was raised Southern Baptist, so I was kind of, still of that mindset most of my life, at least until I was 27. And, I went to college and they mess with your head a little bit, but I still had my fundamental beliefs, essentially. And I was a really good Bible student, so I knew a lot of the verses, okay? But I wasn't into dogma, okay? I was just looking for truth, like most people. Mm-hmm. Well, about that time, I was looking into the story about Abram, since he's the patriarch of the three world's religions, right? Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And I had read stuff just prior to that in Zoroastrianism, and I'll come back to that. But in that in that search, that quest for who these Anunnaki were, these beings that the Sumerians told us about on their cuneiform tablets that are all up and down the Tigris and Euphrates in Iraq and elsewhere, Syria and other places, Iran. I noticed that this patriarch, Abram, was actually from the city of Ur. Well, right up the street from the city of Ur was the city of Nippur. And according to the writings in that area, this was the headquarters of one of the most influential Anunnaki that was on a 12-member council. And his name was Enlil. Okay? Well, it turns out that in one of the Lamentations of Ur, in the second dynasty of Sumer, Ur was the capital city, and their king was Nanar-Sin. Okay? And we knew who his wife was. Her name was Ningal. So all of a sudden you realize through this lamentation account that not only was Nanar-Sin Enlil's son, but he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Nanar-Sin was called in the Atrahasis account none other than Allah. So my head really started spinning at this point, and I realized I needed to make a table of the gods, what their names were in each different culture, so that you could see who they were. So for instance, I just told you that Yahweh was Enlil. Okay, and then over in Greece, he was known as Zeus. So I'm going to kind of stop there without getting all drawn up in names, because we still need to tell the story of where they came from, why they came here, and how it affects our lives.
Right.
Otherwise, why should we care, right?
That's the epic. That's certainly the epic story. So, well, just to start, out of curiosity, you obviously were, you're not coming at this as a scholar of the Sumerian language or history. So I'm just curious, like how you were able to add to some of the mythology that had already been sort of deciphered, decoded,
right.
And
right.
the writings of others, including Sitchin and others who'd already come with their claims about the sky gods and the idea of reinterpreting the meaning of words to mean craft and whatnot. So what was your angle of approach that basically made your work sort of different and distinguished it?
Actually, mine was strictly academic. I wasn't going out turning over stones and bones. I wasn't in that position to do that. There were lots of stones and bones evidences that were in the museums around the world, including cuneiform tablets that were on display that told seminal stories. So I focused on those ones, in particular the ones that were decoded by the University of Oxford, okay? And this is one of my favorite references. There were many, many others, but because these people were the highest level of academia, I chose to pin my first book on their account because at the time, even though I'd read all of Zecharia Sitchin's work, there was a lot of turmoil brewing about whether he told the right story, and it also caused a lot of consternation among the religious community, which I understand now. So starting with those three sources, which to this day, since I published this book in 2013, no one has come to me and said those sources are invalid. You can call them myths if you will, but these were direct translations from the tablets, and I've checked multiple sources to make sure. Okay. So what do we know from these tablets, and what's the story that they're telling us, at least according to the Sumerians? Okay. Well, according to them, these beings, the Anunnaki, came from another planet. They called it their home planet, Nibiru, and they had issues with their atmosphere, much like we're having right now. According to them, in their Enuma Elish account, which is their Babylonian epic of creation, it describes in a celestial allegory of a battle these planets moving through the solar system and having encounters with each other, almost like billiard balls that they're going to bump into each other. Well, in this telling, I decoded that in my first book and realized that the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis, two documents that Zecharia Sitchin pointed us to, were very, very seminal. And if you added just one more document in there, the Epic of Gilgamesh, you'd have all the key players' names according to who the Sumerians said these beings were. So for me, and for you as a producer and a screenwriter, you know that you've got to get the characters right, what their attributes were before you can understand the story, right? Mm. So I attempted to do that. Well, according to them, about 450,000 years ago on their planet, there were perturbations in their atmosphere, probably because they were coming into perihelion with the sun in a long elliptical orbit. And this orbital period they called a Shar, which is, they claimed it to be 3,600 years. And this is in many of their documents, okay? Not only the Enuma Elish, but also in the Sumerian Kings list, you'll see they actually listed their rulerships in Shars, okay? So they were having problems as they came in close to the Earth, having their solar system not originally being part of ours. It looks like their sun, or brown dwarf, people call it various things, but apparently they have a sun, and about 5 planets, and one of those planets is Nibiru that has satellites around it as well. So they decided to bolster their atmosphere. In the writings, Lamu was the king, and he decided that they had 2 choices. They could artificially put something in the atmosphere to shield the radiation as they came into close perihelion with the sun, or they could fire weapons of destruction into the volcanoes and cause it to be seeded that way. Okay, so we know that if you have a very large volcanic eruption, it can put up enough material into the sky to, at least on Earth, to cause a nuclear winter. Okay, so you got to be careful of that, and also you can't really ascertain exactly what the chemical composition of what you're releasing up there. So it's kind of a more dangerous way to do it. They chose to use gold, according to them, and they would ionize it and put it in their atmosphere to shield this radiation, especially when they came in close to the sun. Imagine being out, I don't know, 50 billion years or 50 billion miles away from the sun, and then you come into close perihelion within, some distance that's far less than that, and what the intensity of the radiation difference would be. So each time they came in, this layer that they had put in the atmosphere would get stripped away slightly, and they'd have to redo this. Okay, so they had a continuous need for some transition metal, which they preferred gold because of its ability to not tarnish, and it's an absolute wonderful radiation shield. So according to the account, after a while, they changed kings. The new king was named Anu. He dispatched his chief premier's son, Enki, or Ea Enki, and he's called Nudimmud in the Enuma Elish account, to the Earth to acquire gold. For some reason, they knew that it was here, maybe because they did spectroscopic studies being in retrograde orbit to the Earth, but they knew it was here. So they dispatched him. According to accounts, he landed in the Persian Gulf, got out of his vessel in his fish suit. He's often shown in a fish suit if you go look up Enki in Babylon, or in the Sumerian culture, with water coming out of his, with a fish, and he's the Lord of the Sea, just like Poseidon, right? Mm-hmm. So he builds a city called Eridu, right, where the Tigris and Euphrates join and then empty through the Reed Marsh into the Persian Gulf, which has changed locations over time. But that city is still there, and you can go see it with Google Earth. That's the very first city. He called it Earth Station 1, or his Station Far Away, his home far away, right? There's their outpost, so they get gold. They initially looked for gold colloidally in the ocean. If it's already in that form and you can just get it out, you don't have to do any processing, and you can seed it right to your atmosphere. Okay? Apparently they weren't able to get enough of it fast enough. And about 5,000 years later, according to the accounts, Enki's half-brother, okay, no, let's get this straight. Enki's a scientist and a creator. And their father, they share the same father, who's Anu, who's back on Nibiru. Enlil is sent over as a kind of a bureaucratic commander type that his primary function is to maintain the interface between what they called the bond heaven Earth. His city was the city of Nippur, but he also went around through various Sumerian cities, including the city of Ur, where his son Nanar was the king in the second dynasty. Okay, so Enki comes, he's not getting gold fast enough. He ends up in Africa, down near the southeastern part of Africa, to actually mine the gold, which they didn't really come prepared for. They came to get it, monotomically out of the ocean. Well, that meant a different situation for their workforce. They only came with approximately 50 workers that they called the Ajiji. Okay, they're down in Africa now working, trying to get gold, and Enlil is now down in Africa as well. And there seems to be some conflict brewing because these two brothers are half brothers. One of them is the firstborn, and he's really smart and benevolent, and the other one is more of a bureaucratic commander, and he's in line to rule. So the bureaucrats are higher ranking than the scientists, right? So they're down in Africa trying to get gold. The Ajiji complained in the Atrahasis account that after 3,600 years, one Shar, they had enough and they wanted to burn their tools and revolt. Well, it turns out that one of the beings there that riled them up to do that was none other than Allah, if you read the Atrahasis account. It's in the first tablet. You go, Allah? Really? Well, he was like I told you before, he was the son of Enlil. So Enlil was down there with a fortress to kind of beat down the workers, make sure they were producing this gold quick enough. But in the beginning of the Atrahasis, we find out because of this conflict between Enki and Enlil, they cast lots and divided the regions. Enki had all of Africa, Enlil got all of Mesopotamia, Anu went back to Nibiru, and Inanna got the Indus Valley in India. And their half-sister, the other key player that we got to bring in, was Ninmah, or Ninhursag. And she was Enki's and Enlil's half-sister, very important. The ruler in the Anunnaki hierarchy came from a man and his half-sister. And that's still perpetuated in some of the kingdoms around the world today, but that's what they did. And it had to do with preserving mitochondrial DNA. Okay, so we got Anu the father on Nibiru, Enki the scientist down in Africa mining gold. Enlil is down there with a fortress that's mentioned in the Atrahasis account, making sure bureaucratically they're meeting their milestones on the Gantt chart, right? And about this time, when Allah riled them up, told them to burn their tools in the account, they headed to Enlil's house with this whole mob, and apparently by this time they had about 200 or more workers. They started out with 50, but they got more. They surrounded his house, asked for relief. Enlil came out with his guard, Nusku, and told them, look, just kill one and get them back to work. And about that time, it looks like they called for a council meeting because it was getting out of control. And Enki and several of the council members, there was a 12-member council with 6 men and 6 women. And I'm kind of focusing on the top-ranking council members because it's easier to tell the story that way. But there were 6 men and 6 women. It was evenly balanced. The problem was Enlil was the highest-ranking being on Earth because his father was back on Nibiru. And Enki was just the next rank below him, okay? So at this point, Anu shows up, Enki shows up, Ninhursag's there, even Ningishita and Ninurta were there. These are other beings that you could be able to look up on my genealogy table who they were. But they're all basically Enkyites and Enlilites. They're Enki and his offspring and Enlil and his offspring. And in general, they were opposed to each other because of this inheritance problem between the 2 brothers. You with me? Mm-hmm. Okay. So at this point, they decide that the Igigi had been worked too long, and they did deserve relief. And Anu, the king, basically said, they deserve to be relieved. And Enki chimed in and said, I could help with that. And basically said, there are bipedal hominids down on the plains of Africa where we are that we believe we could genetically modify to create a primitive worker that can replace the Igigi and meet the labor requirements that we need. Okay? So that's amazing to find that out. About that time, his half-sister Ninmah, who was the medical officer, okay? Very important to have one of those when you're on an outpost planet, alien planet, right? Well, she volunteered to work with him. They went off to their house of Shinti in South Africa, according to the account, and they messed with all kinds of chimeras, animal DNA, to come up with a primitive worker that could follow their instructions to do the heavy lifting for the Anunnaki. Okay? And the Sumerians told us this. They knew that they were designed for this purpose, but they didn't have a problem with it. It's us that didn't know it that are really reeling finding this information out.
Well, that's part of the interesting question when it comes to this this history, is that the argument goes that actually the Anunnaki were not really the creators of mankind, but the genetic alterers of mankind, that actually they may have actually harmed us by turning us into slaves. We may have actually been more advanced beings before they came and altered our genetics, and then basically recast themselves in the light of being gods. They basically usurped that role of creator, of source creator, of basically of a universal source creator. They usurped that role to take on these various titles and basically write our biblical accounts and our histories to make them into the true gods.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth in what you said, and I think somewhere between what the story we're telling, it's in between there somewhere. Because I will acknowledge, listen, we know that Lucy, a bipedal hominid, has been on this planet for 3.5 million years. Klaus Dana has found many artifacts, and many other researchers have as well, to indicate that there's been some sort of intelligent occupation of this planet for millions of years. It's not just 450,000 years ago. If the story is true, though, I think that they probably had access to many bipedal hominids, whether it was Cro-Magnon, the Denisovians, Neanderthal. I think they messed with the DNA of lots of them. So they could have actually spawned other offshoots that didn't work out that are still around, for that matter.
Well,
Now, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, like, that raises an important question, too, of the whole notion of them actually, the Anunnaki being like the Elohim in the Bible, who said, let us create them in our image or recreate them. What is your take on what the Anunnaki actually look like?
Well, let me go back to Genesis 1:6, what you're talking about there. It said, let us in our image and our likeness create man. Well, the reason that very statement, that verse out of the Bible was so important to Eric von Däniken and others was, if you go back to the Sumerian account and you read the Atrahasis, you'll realize at that council meeting in Africa, when they decided to give relief to these workers, they said exactly that. Let us create man in our image and our likeness. We'll put our mark on them, meaning we'll give them some of our genetics, and then their heartbeat will be heard forever, meaning, we put spirit into this new species and they're ours, and they have our mark. So I think that coincides with the Genesis 1:6 statement exactly. The problem with, and to go back to what you said, I do believe they had a lot of editorial oversight in writing our later literature, okay? And you can compare and contrast them. I would challenge anybody to compare and contrast the Atrahasis with the Genesis version in the Bible. Mm-hmm. If you just took those tablets from the Atrahasis and compare it, it'll blow your mind.
But what do you think that they look like?
Well, we don't have to imagine too much what they look like. If you go to the Temple of Persepolis in Iran and look at the beings that they've carved on there, I think there's exact replicas of what Enki looked like, what Zarathustra looked like. You can go down into Sumer and look at the statues they built of them there. Listen, they looked just like us. Because when it all came down to it, Enki decided that he was going to use his genetic material, his reproductive genetic material, to in vitro fertilize his sister with the zygote of a bipedal hominid. And I believe, and I think the genetics will show this, that it was either Neanderthal or Cro-Magnon. Okay?
But they look just like us, and yet so many of the ancient gods were depicted actually as cat-like, reptilian, bird-like.
Right. Well, that brings up the whole question of what could they look like? And this is what I want to bring out. The concept of an avatar is now out in the public. We've seen a movie about it and such. But the concept of an avatar really needs to be understood as not just some mythological construct. Okay? In their writings, and even in the Egyptian writings, they talk about the ability as higher dimensional beings to take on any form that they want in any dimension. So if they want to show up as a winged dragon flying around, they can do that. If they want to turn into an eagle, they can do that. If they want to be a half ibis bird and half man, they can do that. And that's really hard for us to wrap our heads around. But let's go back to the Atrahasis account when Enki created the first avatar, okay? In that set of tablets, of 11 tablets, he talks about when they were going to create this first being, how he did it. He actually killed one of the Igigi gods to take its energy. Of course, you have to understand, these Igigis were the ones doing all the mining, so they were already a biological slave, so why wouldn't you take this consciousness from that one if you're going to create a new one, right? He says he killed him, took his energy, and then went through this complex ritual that he describes to infuse that energy into the body of this being he called the Adapa and bring it to new life. And at that point, he tells them we gave him 120 years and intelligence, but that's it.
Should we say that the Igigi looked like Greys, for example? Were they that kind of beings, or what did they look like?
Well, the Igigi, somebody has brought that up before. And the Igigi workers were essentially what we would call the Watchers, okay? Okay, so they were the Watchers, and they were very scientific. And the reason they were called the Watchers is they would man low Earth orbit craft and various observation posts on the Earth to watch the weather, watch the Earth events and changes in order to report to their hierarchy. Plus, they did a lot of the hard work too, but they were considered fellow gods. But what I want to go back to with this avatar creation, so now I'm going to cover the Greys for you, okay, is Enki created the very first instance of taking energy and infusing it into a body so that it'd be animated. Now you think about that. Think about that. That is very complex. And if that's true, guess what? Every single instance of life that they created is an avatar. Okay, so you've got energy and matter fused together to create a functional being that operates according to their constraints. You're still their slave, whether you know it or not.
Right.
Okay. So let's talk about the Greys.
Well, I was going to say with the Ajiji, would you describe their appearance would be?
Well, in the Lost Book of Enoch, which is not lost, we found it now. In the Book of Enoch, they talk about the Watchers and having children with the primitive workers that Enki created. Well, guess what? It wasn't just the Ajiji that were doing it. Marduk, one of Enki's sons, had a human wife. Enlil had a human wife, and Enki had many, many children with the primitive workers that he created. Apparently, they were very, very well designed. Okay, and they looked just like the Anunnaki did. Now, so if you read about these giants of the Nephilim of the past, they didn't look reptilian or crazy. They looked like us. They were just very tall. Now, this is where it gets kind of nutty. Is, well, what kind of being were these reptilians? These other ones that are showing up all around the world. Is there more than one race here? Well, according to Paul Hellyer, the ex-Secretary of Defense in Canada, he said there were 4 that were known and up to 20 that had been on this planet for thousands of years. So there's multiple races around, okay? I believe the alien Greys, let's just pin that one down since they're very popular, were a biological entity created by the Anunnaki for space operations where they didn't have to eat, they weren't sensitive to gravity, and they used them as liaisons for various missions around the Earth. Well, something went bad between them, and I think they ended up at war with each other. But I think actually there was a long history between the Anunnaki and the alien Greys.
Mm-hmm. So the Ajiji, you would say, they'd look like giants, basically?
Well, it's kind of curious. Essentially, if you mix the Anunnaki pureblood DNA with a primitive worker's DNA, and this, it may have been the early primitive worker DNA before it got completely diluted. Apparently, after some period of time, something happened because of their constructs of their bodies, and this is right out of the Bible as well, that they, over time, would become what was called a Gaborim. They would grow very tall. And this happened to the king of the city of Uruk, who was Gilgamesh, if you read about him. He started out as a normal-sized guy, and next thing, after some period of time in his rulership, he became very, very tall. So tall, he was holding 2 lions on his chest, wrestling them like cats, okay? He was very tall, and he towered over all the other people in the town. So this also turned out to be, according to Charles Hall, who wrote Millennial Hospitality, several books on it, that their internal organs could not keep up with their skeletal structure when they did start to grow based on the disparity of gravity here versus the genetics where their gravity was designed for, or where their gravity where their genetics was designed for. So imagine on Nibiru, or wherever they were, I don't know if it's Orion, or one of the Orion constellation, or the Pleiades, wherever they were from, their gravity experience might have been different than it was here. And that has a very significant impact on the human body, on a body, period, a biological body.
Of course. And then in terms of let's get to this issue of how things broke down between Anunnaki and Enlil, because ultimately, if we take into the account the floods, right, the idea is that Enlil ultimately decides that the workers once they're able to procreate, this new human species is able to procreate, there become too many of them, overpopulation in a sense. They create too much noise, so-called, right? And Enlil says, let's just wipe them out.
Exactly.
And
That's right.
To save them, right? Or
that's right out of the After Faces account, exactly. Mm-hmm. You want me to tell that story right up to the flood, so we got that? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what is the essential point of this sort of this moment of the flood? Is it actual? You think the flood was actually created by the gods, or was it just sort of maybe a polar shift that they saw coming and they understood was coming, so they said, let this species get wiped out? Had it already achieved its purpose as far as mining gold was concerned?
Well, I think that was the consequence of knowing about an earth change that wasn't communicated to humans, whether they caused it or not. And I'll run through that just real quickly for you, because we kind of left out some stuff from creating 2 avatars, the Adam and the Eve. They couldn't procreate initially. They had to have a genetic upgrade. This is where Enki's son, his scientific son who carried the Caduceus, comes in. He was known as Thoth in Egypt, but he was known as Nigashita, okay? And he was extremely scientific, and He was also mentioned in the Enuma Elish accounts in the Babylonian Epic of Creation, so he goes way back. Okay, this particular being studied the Adapa that Enki and his half-sister Ninmah created, found the genetic problem why they couldn't procreate, did the gene splicing so that they could, and then they took them back to this first city I told you about, Eridu, where they could monitor them, and this is where your Garden of Eden account comes in. Okay, the Eden was a portion of the area around the city of Eridu. Okay, and we believe it was a significant garden area that they had used to, establish a large garden representing all the different plants from around the world, probably medicinal and everything else as a scientist. Okay, well, about the time they did that, you have the Garden of Eden story where supposedly God comes in and says, don't eat this particular plant or you'll die. Well, that was Enlil, okay? The city of Eridu still belonged to Enki, even though Enlil had Mesopotamia, okay? He did not give that up. So Enki and Enlil were both in Eridu watching these beings see if they could procreate, okay? So they get told, don't eat this plant that's going to wake up your consciousness, because you know what? We don't have any open slots on the Anunnaki Council for you, so just stay down there and be a dumb, primitive worker. That's what we designed you for, right? So this idea of aspirations for higher consciousness was not something Enlil was fond of. Although Enki designed them and built it into us so that we could access that, I don't think Enlil truly understood or knew that at the time. Well, then you have this biblical story where they consume this plant, they don't die, but they wake up and they're conscious of their nakedness. Okay, so this is representative of the fact that whoever the god was that told them they would die, he lied. He lied. They did not die. The one that was a scientist who was portrayed as a snake, something evil, told them the truth, and exactly what he told them occurred. That's when they were, hoisted out of the garden and said, with all the biblical story, your fallen state and all that. That's all a lie, by the way. The Adapa was taken from the garden over to Enki's city of Eridu, where he became the chief priest and did all these kind of rituals on behalf of Enki, and was very, very highly trained. And that's in my second book under the Adapa tale, okay? Mm-hmm. So that's the real truth from the Sumerian account. So going forward, now these guys can procreate. Enlil wanted some of the slaves up in Mesopotamia, and Enki needed them in Africa to replace the Igigi workers who were revolting, essentially. Okay? Well, in that account, we find out that Enlil got real pissed about how much noise they were making. And he calls a council meeting and decides that he's going to get rid of them. Okay? So at this point, you're like, what? Where's the benevolent Enki and his half-sister that created us to stop him? Well, they were lower ranking than Enlil was. So he was pulling rank on them and decided he was going to have his way. Maybe they had all the gold they wanted. Maybe Enlil just felt threatened by them because, listen, after 600 years of this primitive worker program, how many beings do you think they had? Think about in the United States, a 200-year-old nation. We've got 300 million people, and that's with wars and disease and all the other things that go on. They could have had millions of people in 600 years. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, in the Atrahasis account, it specifically says after 600 years, this is when this occurred. Well, go back to the Bible now. When Noah was the king of the city of Shuruppak, okay, that city's very important. He was the king there. Okay. Well, it's the exact same story. 600 years, a flood came, and he was the king. Okay, so this story is being told by a being called Atrahasis, who, by the way, is the king of Shuruppak. Okay, you're going to find that out. So that's why it's so important. 600 years goes by, now there's all this noise, slaves everywhere, and Enlil had enough. He wanted them silenced. And he mandated that disease be introduced to the populace to cull them. He introduced Sarupo disease, Asako disease. And you read about these in the tablets, very devastating. Then you start thinking about HIV and Ebola and AIDS and all the other things that are going on this planet right now. Mm-hmm. Okay, so after all of this, cutting off the food, cutting off the water, and Atrahasis running interference on behalf of the people, going to his god, Enki, to find out what he should do about this terrible onslaught. Well, after 6 years of this, they were down to eating each other. There was no food, no water, and it was just disgusting, okay? And Enlil still wasn't done with them. He wanted them all gone, and that's when he approached his brother Enki and asked to bring a flood to destroy them. He refused. Somehow the flood came anyway. We know that from the Noah account, and it turns out that this Noah Atrahasis being is Enki's son. That's why he's trying to help him. He's the king of Shuruppak. That ought to tell you something right there. They didn't make just anybody king. They had to have royal blood, right? So it turns out that's the same city where Ninmah or Ninhartsog was the medical officer. They shared that city together. Well, at that point, this is where the Noah story comes in, where Enki decides not to keep the oath that he's sworn to the council. He goes to the reed hut and talks to the wall, knowing his kid's in there, and tells him, "I'm talking to the wall. I'm not talking to you." So he's not breaking his oath, right? And that's when he tells him to get out of the territory because it belongs to his brother and a flood's coming. And he decides to do that. He saves himself and the seed bank and some of the farm animals they had locally. They certainly didn't bring animals from all over the world. They did it genetically. Okay, and they also had an Anunnaki navigator on board to take them to a safe place, which turned out to be Mount Ararat. So Noah Atrahasis ends up there. They have an encounter with Enlil and the crew that were on the low Earth orbiting craft to assess the damage that was caused by this flood. He sees the boat up there, lands, and this is where Enki and Enlil will get into it and talking about, we don't have any slaves to serve us. Hey, I saved him because he's my son. Right? And then Enlil does something very out of character. He decides to give Atrahasis eternal life, meaning access to the elixirs or bread of life or the water of life that they describe in the Adapa tales that they were partaking of to keep their biological form from decaying. Mm-hmm. Okay? So that was the story up to the Genesis account in the Garden of Eden all the way up to the flood.
Yeah.
Now after that, I believe this was circa 12,000 years ago, right after the last ice age. Okay, and I've done some tables to look at, could it possibly be coincident with the passage of their planet that caused these earth perturbations and a great flood? And that's very possible as well. Okay, and a lot of people believe that.
Well, it's interesting because I'm just thinking the Enlil-Enki rivalry, and then the Noah, the Noah as Enki's son concept is similar to the Osiris-Set battle, right, within Egyptian lore, and the idea of Horus being a continuation of Osiris, right?
It's exactly right. And if you look at the symbolism, you'll start to realize that, for instance, let's just do this now then. Enki was known as, Enki means Lord of the Earth. Let's just talk about the rival problem, first of all. Enlil means Lord of the Air. Okay, that's what that directly translates to. Mm-hmm. So originally, when Enki was here, he was the Lord of the Earth, the whole Earth, okay? And the Earth it was another name, the Sumerian name for it was Ki, K-I. Okay, so Enki means Lord of the Earth. Well, he had other names as well. We need to get used to the idea of them having multiple names. Enlil and Enki were fighting over the Lord of the Earth command title when Enlil came 5,000 years later, and he was higher ranking. So essentially he came in and caused problems for Enki by asserting himself. They just did not get along. And I think this was a large part of it, was their inheritance right.
So I want to continue the story about what happened to the Anunnaki after the floods and why they're no longer visible to us, why we know that this is part of our mythology now and maybe our history, but it's no longer evident, let's say, to our eyes. So yeah. I want to get to that on the next show. So I want to cut here and leave our audience with this, basically to digest this information and this story, and then I'll come back to you for the next episode, part 2. We'll discuss what happened to the Anunnaki and where they went.
Okay, that sounds great, Sean.
Cool.
That'll be a good place to break it. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gerald. Well, there you go, folks. A bit of our mythology from ancient Sumeria. Is it real? Is it just a myth? This is up to you to decide. This is Sean Stone signing off.